Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Ingevity wants to just thank you again for your participation. We are proud to host these webinar series called Connecting the Dots. We know that the industry globally has the opportunity to get together throughout the year to talk about technology and some of the initiatives that are happening when it comes to infrastructure and road building. But at the agency level, we know that these opportunities are less. So we wanted to help sponsor and create a forum dedicated to agencies and helping generate awareness of technologies and what is needed to make those technologies succeed. So today we have invited you to a presentation about the FAST Act, specifically overview and implementation experience. Our speaker today is Lynn Zanto. She is an administrator with the Transportation Planning Division at the Montana Department of Transportation. And I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to begin our presentation today. I will also let you know before Lynn begins that you are welcome to chat your questions. You can do that in the lower left side of your screen, and I will help to moderate those questions. Lynn has given us the permission to go ahead and entertain questions throughout the presentation, so I will do my best to get to all the questions that we have while she's speaking, or if we feel it's more appropriate to kind of wait till the end, we can also do that. But feel free to go ahead and chat your questions in the lower left of your screen. Okay, Lynn, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Amy, and it is a pleasure to be here today and be presenting to all of you in the Connecting the Dots Forum and on the FAST Act. So as Amy mentioned, I am the Planning Administrator for the Montana DOT. I've been with state government for 25 years and the majority with the Montana Department of Transportation. However, I did take a couple years in the middle of my career and went and did fiscal analysis for our legislative staff. I've had the pleasure of working at both the technical, the program, and the policy levels, and have been an administrator for the past 8 years. So what I hope to do with today's presentation is provide a bit of context about rural Montana first, because I understand I'm talking to my fellow DOTs across the state, and we all are unique in our own ways, so I'll provide a bit about our context, and then working within the federal program as a rural state. And with the FAST Act provisions, I will focus primarily on the highway side because that is primarily what we deal with in Montana. So we'll move into the basic outline. I'll give the context, I'll give a general overview of the FAST Act. Implementation status, we're not quite a year into the FAST Act, but I'll highlight a few things from our perspective of what we've experienced, and then talk a little bit about looking ahead and what's next at the federal level. So first, just here's a map of our country, and probably most of you know where Montana is, but if not, we are in the northwest portion of the country, and we border Canada. And we are a large land area state. You can see we've got a lot of land when you look at the rest of the states, except for obviously Alaska, Texas, and California. Go ahead, Amy. So in terms of land area, we're the 4th largest land area state, and our land area, if you took the 10 North Atlantic states, we're larger than the combined area of those states, yet we only have 2% of the combined population of those states. So we're very rural. We have the 3rd fewest people per square mile of all states. I believe our people per square mile is 7 people per square mile, yet we pay the 4th highest amount per capita to the Highway Trust Fund at $181 per capita. There's 56 counties in our state, and 52 of them are larger than Rhode Island's land area, and 24 would not meet the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of settled, which is 2 persons per square mile. So a lot of our population resides in the western part of the state, and as you go east, it gets really rural, and that's where a lot of those counties that have less than 2 persons per square mile are. In terms of travel and our highway system, About 70% of our vehicle miles traveled is rural. I think we're in the top 7 of all states in terms of rural travel. Uh, the, and if you were to travel from our northwest corner, the community of Yak, to our southeast corner, which is the community of Alzada, it's longer than traveling between Chicago and Washington, D.C. If you went by road, it's 787 miles, but if you went as the crow flies, it's 744. In terms of urban areas, we only have 3 areas in the state that are over 50,000 population, so have the status of a metropolitan planning organization. And our biggest community is about 120,000 people. So rural, we do have 7 reservations, and given all that, we are very dependent on the federal program. Our only funding source from a state side is fuel tax. We don't receive any general fund, and so fuel tax and motor carrier vehicle fees are how our transportation system is funded. Rail, we have no state operated rail in the state. And in terms of transit programs, we have 40 transit systems, but most of them are rural and more on-demand type transit. So very dependent on the federal program, and our state funds are just enough for us to match the federal funds and then take care of our highway maintenance needs. So not a lot of extra. We do function more as a pay-as-you-go state. We're pretty risk adverse, so we don't do a lot of the innovative financing that is allowed through the federal program. We view that more as a tool if needed, but you still need revenue to paying back a lot of that financing. So with our revenue sources pretty limited, we don't do a lot of innovative financing, so I won't get into much of those provisions. Okay, so now we'll move on to the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act. And as you all know, Congress passed the FAST Act in December 2015. So as I mentioned, we're not quite a year into implementation of the act, but it was it's the first long-term surface transportation bill in a decade. And overall, I think it's a pretty good bill. It provides 5 years of federal funding certainty. Go ahead and move on. Thank you. So 5 years of federal funding certainty, so stable and predictable funding through September 30th of 2020. It did include a slight overall program funding increase, which amounted to a little more than inflation. The majority of the funding from the Highway Trust Fund is distributed to the states through formula. I think it's at 92 or 93%, and that's positive because it gives us all more flexibility in how we manage our program and meet our needs. It continued the congressional philosophy of no earmarks, so unlike what we saw in Safety Lou in 2005, it did not have earmarks. And the revenue from the Highway Trust Fund is over $281 billion nationwide for the 5-year period. In order to get to that revenue level, it did require transfers from the general fund, about $70 billion. And these were more offsets by a number of pay-fors, and I won't get into all those specifics, but I think the point there is that the Highway Trust Fund is not sustainable over time, and even prior to the FAST Act, there have been several general fund transfers to keep funding for highways and transit moving through the trust fund. One other aspect on the revenue side that is worrisome from our perspective and probably from most DOTs is that it includes a $7.6 billion rescission in 2020. And in terms of the rescission, this is to occur July 1st of 2020, and it's called out in Section 1438 of the FAST Act. And what we see that as is a lost flexibility and can potentially impact program delivery across our program. So we'll watch that closely, and hope that Congress gives states flexibility in how we apply that rescission and that they don't dictate more what categories we take it from. Um, Other notable program aspects is that the FAST Act really was minor adjustments, where MAP 21 that was passed 2 years prior was more major program reform. So the FAST Act extends the program structure through 2020 that was established in MAP 21. Probably one minor caveat to that is that it did include a new freight program and freight discretionary program, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later in the presentation. One of the features of MAP 21 was the establishment of national performance measures and the national performance goals for transportation, and the FAST Act didn't change much there. A lot of it is because we are still deep into the rulemaking and seeing what that will all entail, and haven't quite, we're just in the infancy of implementation on certain parts of the performance side. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And I think two really good things about the FAST Act is the stability that it's provided in terms of the 5 years of funding. That allows us as DOTs to better plan, develop, and deliver our improvement projects. For the decade prior, as we were juggling short-term extensions, it really is disruptive to projects and hard for any of us to plan and advance our program. And again, it's the first long-term bill since safety law expired in 2009. From the flexibility side, it allows us, it retained a lot of the state flexibilities that have been in federal law for quite a while in terms of providing funds through formula so that we can look at our system, identify our needs, and best invest where it's going to make a difference in our state. There's transferability, 50% transferability that was retained between the core highway programs. Again, that helps us put the money where the needs are, and the flexibilities help avoid that sort of one-size-fits-all approach that each of us is very unique in terms of what we deal with. So we've appreciated that part of the bill. So although overall we view the FAST Act as a very good bill, it's not perfect, and we do have some anticipated challenges that we see as we move forward. And just to highlight a few of those challenges, one of them is that the highway safety funding from the FAST Act is more restrictive. It's not eligible for behavioral programs, and I know in our state, as we try to work toward what we call Vision Zero and eliminating fatal and serious injuries on our highways, as we look at the main causal factors, it really is more behavioral related than infrastructure. So in Montana, our three major contributors to crashes on our system and fatal and serious injuries are run off the road crashes. So that's the aspect we can address with this highway safety funding and try to improve our infrastructure. But I would say over 2/3 of our crashes are attributed to impaired driving or lack of seat belts. And prior to the FAST Act, we could use funding to help address some of those behavioral aspects, but with the FAST Act, we can't. We still have the National Highway Safety Traffic Administration funding, which is the NHTSA funding to address behavioral, but that we have found has been less money there for us in both MAP 21 and the FAST Act. Performance reporting, again, the National Performance Framework has continued through the FAST Act, and one change is that under MAP 21, we would have 2 reporting cycles for the feds to assess if we were achieving progress toward the targets that we'll establish. Under the FAST Act, they put that evaluation of achieving progress to 1 year, and if within 1 year of reporting we don't, they don't determine that we're achieving progress, then it kicks us into some penalties or those penalties range from having to do extra reporting or having to direct certain funds to certain types of projects. There are some things like the FAST Act changed the name of the Surface Transportation Program to the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, and not too much changed in terms of how that funding program works or its eligibilities, but some of the challenge that we are seeing is block grant implies that some people interpret that to mean that we distribute funds out to, say, our local governments, and then they manage and administer and do with them as the law provides. But in reality, we still administer the funds. Again, keep in mind that we don't have any urban areas that hit the 200,000 threshold. And so part of our concern with the name change is it could cause confusion amongst our stakeholders, when in reality and how the program functions, it hasn't changed too much. Another requirement
Lynn,
is...
can we stop you for just one second? We're getting a question in asking if you can explain the rescission process.
Sure.
Again, what is it and where is the funding taken from, and even is it the same for all states? Do you mind walking us through that?
Sure. I will explain it to the best that I can. But so within the federal program, the FAST Act and the authorization bill provide us the level of expenditure. So let's just say, for simplicity, what was it? $280 billion is our apportionment level, and then each year the annual appropriators give us our obligation authority, which normally has been less than the amount of apportionment. So then you have this gap between the spendable dollars and the dollars you can't touch. So the intent of the rescission is that come 2020, any of the money sitting in the various funding categories in our highway program, they'll rescind a certain level. Congress will basically take that away. And I had mentioned those flexibilities where we can transfer between categories. How they apply it, I don't know the exact mechanics, but we have seen rescissions where they apply a percentage across the board to each funding category. And so if you have projects planned or upcoming to be led in that funding category and the rescission hits, those funds may not be there to deliver that project. So what we're doing in Montana, what we will watch closely is we'll monitor our 5-year program and our lettings and ensure that with that transferability ability that we will move money in the categories that we need it if we can. But ultimately, given the level of the rescission, we're worried it is going to impact our actual project delivery for what we have planned. And we had done a little white paper on that. I can send that to you, Amy. It's super complicated, and how they apply it could change when we get to 2020. The other thing I would mention is in the annual appropriations process. So right now, Congress has not given us our obligation authority or our spendable funding for 2017 yet. They haven't said how much we can spend of the funding provided in the FAST Act. The Senate has its version of an appropriations bill, and the House has theirs. The Senate version does have an additional rescission of highway funds. So the House version does not, and Congress just got back in session, and it's appearing that they probably will not give us a full obligation authority or a full appropriations bill before the end of the calendar year. They'll probably just give us a continuing resolution through, who knows, a month or 2 months. I'm hearing December. So until they give us that full appropriations bill, we won't know if they give us an additional rescission in 2017, and that would be on top of what is in the Act for 2020.
Okay.
So
great. Awesome. Thanks for giving some attention to that. We appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, so um, in terms of challenges, so the freight plan, I don't know if I'd necessarily call it a challenge, but it does add additional requirements to states in terms of we are required to have a state freight plan by December 4th of next year, 2017. And so some states have had freight plans, some have not. That is something that we're in the process right now of doing, is initiating a freight plan. Um, and with that freight plan came a funding category for specifically for freight, and states that do not have a freight plan in place by December 4th of next year can't access those funds until such time that they do. And then the other challenge is that at the congressional level, we still haven't figured out a way to. We don't have a long-term sustainable revenue source. We're still relying on the Highway Trust Fund, and as I mentioned earlier, that's been kept afloat by transfers from the general fund for several years. So now I'll talk about a little bit of some of the wins with the FAST Act. All of us, I believe, are members to AASHTO, and AASHTO had done extensive work on reauthorization policies that they are pushing forward as Safety Lou is coming to an end. And a lot of the policy positions that AASHTO had in place were achieved, and this is a summary of those. So first is that the FAST Act did achieve a long-term surface transportation bill, and it still acknowledges that federally assisted but state implemented relationship, which is important again for giving states the ability to implement our program. It funded the program at a little bit higher levels than what we had, so current levels plus a little higher than inflation. It maintained state flexibility, as I mentioned, and maintained that percent of funding of over 90% coming to us by formula. It resisted the creation of new programs for the most part, except for the freight program, but the freight program really was seen as having a federal purpose. It allowed the DOTs to assume some U.S. DOT responsibilities for design and right-of-way acquisition. And both MAP 21 and the FAST Act had sections that were focused on simplifying and streamlining administrative approval and oversight processes for routine activities. So a big interest in both bills in terms of accelerating project delivery and streamlining. And then from the performance measure standpoint, again, it continued the framework of MAP 21 and didn't expand on that. However, the rulemaking process that is being gone through, we have seen additional measures added beyond what was in the Act itself. So we're watching that closely and are concerned about further burden through the rulemaking process. The one policy area that was not achieved is the long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. So we'll move now into some specifics about our experience with the FAST Act. And again, keep in mind this is from a rural highway state perspective, but there's three areas that I'll touch on. Innovation and streamlining. I'll give you some examples of how we've taken advantage of those provisions. I'll talk a little bit about the freight provisions and then some of the concerns we're seeing with national performance measures. So on innovation and streamlining, basically, according to FHWA, they have noted that there's 18 provisions in the highway title that are designed to increase innovation and improve efficiency. And they sort of fall along four general themes. There's flexibilities to increase efficiencies, and so examples of this is that there's some provisions where mid-century bridges or common mid-century bridges are exempt from some environmental review. There's a provision that allows at-risk bridges to be be replaced without delays to nesting swallows. Um, so there's provisions along increasing efficiencies. There's also provisions that are refining existing authorities that were already in the law, and some of these are related to basically how NEPA is applied and some flexibilities that are given to states in terms of NEPA. One of those examples I'll talk a little bit about is the linking planning in NEPA, and in our state we call it pre-NEPA corridor planning, so I'll mention a little bit about that. Another general theme of the streamlining provisions is adding new tools to help accelerate project delivery. And I'll talk a little bit about a provision that was in MAP 21 and continued into the FAST Act that relates to innovative contracting and how that helps accelerate project delivery and also helps with more favorable federal share for certain projects. And then lastly, in terms of the innovation, where they built on some of their existing activities that Federal Highways had implemented through the Everyday Counts initiatives. So in terms of innovative contracting, some of the items there that we have found useful that have helped us advance our projects maybe quicker for certain types of projects, we have taken advantage of design-build type contracts where we've used that contracting mechanism for certain types of projects like rest areas, maybe retaining walls or slope stability projects, or ADA improvements. And what we found is that has helped us get a project into the design and the contracting process quicker, so that we can move certain projects along. And if I use the example of rest areas, if we did the traditional design bid build process, we were finding that by the time we got to letting a rest area project, some of the building code standards were maybe out of date. So the design build helps us move those projects more efficiently and helps us align better with building codes and those sorts of things that are more time sensitive. Let's see. Another thing that we've done, we sometimes utilize alternative bidding in our contracting. So if we're about to let a project and we might be a little uncertain about the funding package or cost of certain features, we may utilize an alternate bidding feature. And then we have been trying to pursue through our legislature authority to do the construction, the CMCG type contracting. And so far we haven't had success with that, but our legislature will be meeting this next January and hope to achieve authority to use that sort of contracting mechanism to help accelerate our project delivery. On the pre-NEPA corridor planning efforts, Montana, we have done that sort of planning since, we started piloting it in the early 2000s and have found that it has been extremely helpful and beneficial to us in terms of better scoping projects. So traditionally it's like we would identify that, okay, we have this road, it's not up to standard, we need to go reconstruct it. So we jump right into design, and pretty soon we find out that we're in the environmental process and elevated to an EIS type level, which is millions of dollars, and we've had EISs that have taken a decade or more. And so through the pre-NEPA planning process, we have been able to, at a planning level, have early conversations with our public and the resource agencies and go into a project not knowing if there's truly a need, but talking to those stakeholders and finding out what are the issues, if any, along a corridor. And if we identify them, then we use that pre-NEPA planning process to basically develop our purpose and needs statement and also determine if we have a fundable and achievable project or if there's any red flags. And then once we identify a purpose and need and funding to fit an aspect of it, moving an improvement on a corridor, then we move into NEPA. And since we have been doing that process, we have not initiated a new EIS, since probably 2003-ish, and we have no active EISs right now and are able to move our projects more efficiently with less impacts because we're doing better scoping at the planning level before we initiate NEPA and the design. And then the other aspect that I wanted to mention briefly is this provision on increased federal share. And this is 23 U.S.C. Section 120. And essentially what this is it was first established in MAP 21. I think in that bill it's Section 1304. And the purpose is to increase the use of innovations and that accelerate construction and improve efficiency of construction, or that improve safety and quality of highway infrastructure, reduce congestion. And through your division office, you can submit an application for something that is innovative in your state or accelerates project construction. And if it's accepted at your division office, then you are able to get a more favorable federal share on your project. So the typical federal share is 80%, and they can increase the federal participation by up to 5% for a certain percentage of your overall program. And examples of the type of things that they may view as innovative may be like prefabricated bridge elements and systems, innovative construction equipment, materials, or techniques, including the use of in-place recycling technology or warm mix asphalt, intelligent compaction, innovative contracting methods. So, for instance, design build, for us, they wouldn't agree that that was innovative because we had been doing it for so long. But for a state that's never used design build and wanted to try that mechanism for advancing a project quicker, that would be something that the state could apply to their division office to get this more favorable federal match rate.
Lynn, before we continue, if you don't mind, we have another question asking if Montana created the pre-NEPA process, or what was the inception of that?
Okay, so we, what I can tell you is that through the 1990s, we had so many EISs, and the philosophy of both our, I would say our Federal Highway Division office and the head of our Environmental Bureau at the time was, well, you can never do enough analysis. And it seemed like every project we initiated started to elevate to an EIS process. And pretty soon we had these documents that would go on forever, cost millions of dollars, and if they actually got to a record of decision, then we had commitments that we couldn't afford to deliver, and still are trying to deliver a lot of those. So the desire, we had seen that Idaho had done a sort of corridor planning process, and we got authority from our legislature to pilot a similar process. And so we really used the framework that Idaho had established and developed our own guidelines. And that was in the early 2000s and started to have a lot of success. So at the time that the federal planning, statewide and metropolitan planning regulations were being updated for safety lieu, they did have an appendix that made it optional that states could do pre-NEPA planning, but we were interviewed prior to those rules being put in place about our experience. So I wouldn't say we created it, but we definitely, I think Federal Highways took note of how we were doing it, and again, we looked at what Idaho was doing, and a lot of the aspects of our process are in the pre-NEPA planning requirements, the linking planning and NEPA requirements.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that for us.
Sure. Okay, so let me see where I was at. So yeah, so on the increased federal share, a couple examples where we've used it. As I mentioned, we tried to advance an application for our design build process, but our division office said, no, design build isn't innovative for you. You've been doing it for several years, and the authority was established in our state statute several years ago, so they wouldn't accept that as an innovation. But we have done like rapid replacement on critical bridges. We've also, in order to accelerate project delivery, we've typically use a 3/4 inch asphalt mix, and in certain cases we've gone to a 3/8 inch, and they've allowed that for this innovation and higher federal share for those types of projects. So on Federal Highway's website on innovation, they have a lot of examples of what could count as innovative, but they are sure to say that it's not limited to that. So if there's something in your state that you feel is innovative and helping you move a project quicker, and you have interest in a higher federal share, then this is a good provision to advance that under. Okay, so now I'll move into the freight provisions. As I mentioned earlier, this is probably the newest thing, or the provisions that were a little different than anything we've had before that came through the FAST Act. And there's several aspects to the freight provisions. First, there's a National Highway Freight Program, and with that section, essentially, at the federal level, they have identified a national highway freight network made up of what they call the primary highway freight system, and then we as states have the ability to advance a certain number of miles of our highway network as critical rural or critical urban freight corridors. And then with that, through the funding formulas, there's a National Highway Freight Program that then we are able to utilize those funds for improvements along anything that's on this National Highway Freight Network. And then in addition, the FAST Act also established a discretionary grant program, so a program administered by USDOT that states can compete for along with local governments and maybe ports and some other entities. And those are called the Fast Lane grants. USDOT has gone through that first round of solicitation and awards. They recently announced the awards of those grants, and those seem to be aimed at very large projects. I want to say over $100 million. There is a match requirement, and I think that will be similar to the Tiger grants that Federal Highways has done since the Recovery Act. It's just another opportunity to potentially advance some really big projects. And there's also a provision within the discretionary grants for smaller projects, as we've also seen with the Tiger grant process. And then USDOT, there's several provisions within the FAST Act that fall primarily on USDOT for a multimodal freight network, so a freight policy, a plan, and a network. And in August, there just was a comment period that closed that states could comment on what USDOT had identified as their multimodal freight network. And what we had seen through that policy is it had quite a significant portion of the freight rail in our state represented on that network. The highway portion was very limited. For instance, for Montana, it was only our interstate system, and yet if you saw our large land area and the resources we have from energy to agriculture to timber, it's not all in the interstate region. So there's other important components that we feel from a freight aspect in getting goods to market. And so we're hopeful that that USDOT will allow a little bit of expansion of that network. And part of the multimodal freight policy is those state freight plans that I mentioned, where states are to have a state freight plan, and that freight plan can either be standalone or it can be incorporated into each state has to have a long-range transportation plan, so it could be incorporated into that. With it, they had a provision about state freight advisory committees, which states can establish as standing committees for managing freight in their state, but that's an optional provision. It's not mandated that each state have a freight advisory committee. So us, for instance, we're just kicking off initiating our state freight plan, and initially we're not going to form a state freight advisory committee, but we will have stakeholder involvement all through development of our plan. And then once we get our plan in place by next December 4th, or December 4th of 2017, I should say, those plans have to be updated every 5 years. So as we get experience with the freight program, we'll then decide whether it would serve us well to have an actual advisory committee or just engage stakeholders as we're doing plan updates and other freight activities.
Lynn, we have another question if you don't mind. The grants that you're talking about, are these in addition to the state's appropriation?
Correct. So let me see here if I can find the amount. Yes, so the states receive an amount distributed through formula of freight funds, and that is under the National Highway Freight Program, so that first bullet.
Yeah.
The FastLane grants are in addition. They're above and beyond, and it's funding that USDOT administers and solicits the applications. If folks are familiar with the Tiger grants that have been being done every year, they're very similar to those, but with a freight focus. And let me see if I have the provision. I had all the provisions here in front of me, but I could probably add those to the. I don't know if you post this stuff, Amy, but I could add the provisions or.
Yeah, if you'd like to add the provisions, I can post those in addition to posting a recast of the webinar as well, if you'd like.
Okay.
Not a problem.
Okay, and I think I have a slide in here with the various links on the federal websites. So much of this information is pretty easily found on, say, Federal Highways site. I think they've done a pretty good job with their FAST Act and their MAP 21 websites.
Great.
That have a lot of help sheets. So we can go now to national performance measures. And so as I mentioned, the National Performance Measure Framework was established in MAP 21 under 23 U.S.C. Section 150 and essentially laid out, I think, 7 goal areas. And that's what you see in front of you is safety, infrastructure condition, congestion reduction, system reliability, freight movement and economic vitality, environmental sustainability, and reduced project delivery delays. And so it laid out the framework. Within the provisions, the federal agencies are responsible for setting the measures themselves and have been working on rulemaking since MAP 21 was passed. And then Congress gave states the authority and responsibility of setting targets that will fit those measures. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a sort of recap of where FHWA is at in terms of their rulemaking processes. And there have been several notices of proposed rulemaking since I think they started in 2013, 2014. The highway provisions in 2014, you can see that we've had rules for safety performance measures, for the Highway Safety Improvement Program itself, for statewide and metro planning, for pavement and bridge performance measures, along with highway asset management plans, and then the most recent was performance of the National Highway System, freight, and CMAQ, which is congestion mitigation and air quality measures. So the rulemaking's been in full swing since early 2014. To date, there's only a couple rules that have actually been put to final rulemaking, and that's the safety, the highway safety improvement, and the statewide and metro planning. But if you look at the far right column, that shows which ones have been published. And in red, I had put that for safety performance, for instance, that is final, there's 5 different measures that have came through that rulemaking process that now we as states are responsible for setting targets. And those are the number of fatalities, the number of fatal or of serious injuries, the rate of fatalities, the rate of serious injuries. And then when I mentioned early on that it seems like the rulemaking is expanding what Congress intended for measures, there was a 5th measure added to this final safety rule for non-motorized fatal and serious injuries. Then if you go down further, the pavement and bridge performance measures in the proposed rulemaking, there were 6 proposed measures there. That rule is yet to be finalized. And at the very bottom, the performance of the National Highway System freight and CMAQ measures, there's 8 measures there. So if you look just at those rules, there's 19 proposed measures that states are going to have to be setting targets for and reporting on and showing progress. That's just from the federal highway side. In addition, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has 12 additional measures that states are having to report and set targets for. And then the Federal Transit Administration just published a final rule on transit performance, and there's 4 measures there. So collectively, to date, there's potential for 35 measures in this national performance rulemaking. And so I guess why I've spent time noting this is that the MAP 21 and the FAST Act called for a limited set of measures. And I think as to provide a means to the most efficient investment of federal transportation funds, but as this rulemaking is going on, it's appearing to look pretty burdensome, and it's going to be quite a big task for states to manage and comply with. So AASHTO had a very organized approach to commenting on these rulemaking processes, but the concern is that it will be quite a burden on states, and I guess in any future reauthorization efforts, we really hope that they don't keep adding measures and expanding it until we've had time as states to basically see if we can implement what's intended by MAP 21 and the FAST Act, get experience with that, and see if it's really meeting the intent of what was envisioned at the congressional level. So those were sort of 3 areas that we've, in this less than a year, have really been dabbling in and have spent quite a bit of time in. As I mentioned, there are some very helpful links in terms of maneuvering the FAST Act and some of these provisions that I mentioned. So AASHTO has a really good reauthorization webpage, and the link is there, and you can find a lot about the AASHTO policy positions. And they are publishing a report each month, I think, in terms of implementation and some of the issues that we're seeing at the AASHTO level, and if any progress has been made in that regard. There's also a performance webpage that AASHTO has with all the rulemakings or proposed rules, all the state comments, the AASHTO comments. On that one in particular, I think whoever in your DOT is dealing with performance probably has access, and there's a password that they would have established to get into it. In terms of like the innovative financing provisions, AASHTO does have a finance center that has a lot of information for those states that take advantage of those provisions. And then FHWA, as I mentioned, there's their FAST Act website has the legislation, links to the rules, any of their guidance that they've published, presentations that they've done, both for the FAST Act and the MAP 21 links. They also have a performance page where you can find all the rulemaking processes and status of those. And then the innovation, so the innovation provisions that I talked about, you can find a lot more information about those at FHWA's link. And then I didn't talk a lot about transit, but the Federal Transit Administration as well has a FAST Act page in Map 21 that can highlight the provisions that are the changes that they have seen through those two pieces of legislation. So looking ahead at the federal level in terms of what's next, so as I mentioned, the FAST Act is a 5-year bill and it'll expire September 30th of 2020, which might seem a long way away, but in terms of dealing with federal policy, it probably really isn't. And so I think what's important for states in terms of the next authorization is to preserve the policy wins that have been achieved through MAP 21 and the FAST Act. That long-term fix to the Highway Trust Fund is still a huge issue for all of us, and how is transportation going to be funded into the future? We hope that the next reauthorization will continue progress made toward innovation and streamlining. I think that's expected by our customers, that we deliver our programs efficiently and get projects out the door, and also that there isn't further expansion of the national performance measures. By the time this bill expires, with the just the safety rule being finalized, the first time that federal highways will evaluate our progress under safety will be in 2020. So it's quite a lengthy process in terms of developing the national performance program, the rules, and then states developing targets, and then reporting those, and then the federal agencies assessing progress. So at least from Montana's perspective, we really hope that there's no further expansion before states have had time to implement the requirements and see how it's working overall. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Amy. I think she has a few quick slides.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Actually, we are coming up to about an hour, so just wanted to go ahead and give anybody a chance to ask any last questions that they may have, and you can feel free to speak your question, unmute yourself and speak your question, or you can chat it in if you'd like, and we'll be sure to get to those. So I'll give you a second to chime in. So we do have a question, Lynn. If our states can't meet the performance measures, will they lose funding?
In terms of the performance measures, it isn't losing funding, and that was something AASHTO pushed very hard, is don't tie it to funding. But what does happen is, for instance, in safety, or let me think, on the NH performance measures, it may direct us to spend a certain amount of our funding at a certain level on our national highway system or on bridges of some sort. So the penalties are more putting constraints around how we're spending some of our funding, or requiring us to report additional reporting that we have to do on how we're going to address not meeting our performance targets.
Great. Anyone else? Okay, with that, I'd just like to thank you again for participating. For those participants on the call, we will be following up with you to provide credit for professional development hours. Also, just to note that if you'd like to listen in again, or you wanted to share this webinar with colleagues that could not be with us today, we'll be posting a recast of this link on our connectingthegovdots.com website. So watch out for that. And with that, just have a wonderful afternoon. And again, thank you so much for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again in October. Have a great day.